Okay, so look, it's no secret for any of you who have been watching my channel for a little bit that I think the villain is a really important part of any good movie. Maybe not necessarily a villain in all cases, but at least the antagonist. The thing that is pushing the protagonist back and allowing them to grow as a character and develop more. The barrier, if you will. And it's also no secret that I think a lot of the Marvel villains are straight up trash. I think they're horrible. A lot of them, at least. However, if you've been following both me, this channel, and the Marvel Cinematic Universe, you're going to realize that it's not exactly a balanced playing field, so to speak. It's not as if there are 2 bad villains in Phase 1, 2 in Phase 2, and 2 in Phase 3. There's actually a gradual shift towards better villains in Phase 3. Now again, this is my opinion, and you may not agree with me at all, which is fine. You may think that all the villains in Phase 3 are terrible, and you may think the Phase 1 villains are the best. Totally fine. But to me, there is a fundamental shift in the quality of villains when you go from Phase 1 to Phase 3. They're just better characters in my view. And I wanted to explore in today's video why that is. How did Marvel fix their villain problem? In order to do so, I wanted to explore each phase individually and talk about why I think each one works and each one doesn't in terms of establishing their villains. And to start, we're going to start at the beginning with Phase 1, which I'm going to dub You Didn't Even Try. So when the Marvel Cinematic Universe was first beginning, it was pretty clear, and Kevin Feige later confirmed this in later interviews, that they weren't really focusing on the villains. That's totally fine, because the heroes are the most important parts. Again, they were not building up to a Sinister Six, they were building up to the Avengers. It was of utmost importance that Kevin Feige developed Iron Man, Hulk, Captain America, Thor, and the rest of the Avengers, Black Widow, and Hawkeye. But as a byproduct of this, the villains in Phase 1 were of a lower quality. Why is this? First, I just want to point you to a general lack of screen time, which is actually a fundamental problem in all of these Phase 1 movies. And again, it's not technically a problem, it is just something that contributed to the lack of villain motivation and character development. But, lack of screen time. So if you notice in the Phase 1 films, there is actually relatively little screen time given to the villains in each of the films. For example, in Iron Man 1, while Obadiah is a presence in the movie, towards the second and beginning of the third act, he rarely appears. It is all about Tony Stark developing his Iron Man persona. In The Incredible Hulk, the Abomination is kind of sort of there, but not really until the very end when he turns into a CGI mess. In Iron Man 2, there's a little bit more time spent with the villains. However, there are 2 villains in this case, so the time spent between the 2 of them are kind of split between Justin Hammer and Whiplash. With Thor, you barely see Loki in the second and third act. I mean, you see him at the end a little bit, but he's mostly there in the first act to set up his villainous arc. Captain America the First Avenger is Captain America beating up Nazis in a montage for about 20 minutes of the movie. And the Avengers, well, Loki is integrated very nicely into the story, so he's there for a lot of it. But still, you can see a pattern within these first 5 MCU origin films leading up to the Avengers. The villains just weren't given a lot of screen time. And again, that goes back to the point I made earlier that Kevin Feige was saying that the heroes were the important part of this phase, not the villains, which is totally fine. Because again, if the heroes weren't as important and you wanted to make a really solid villain, well, the Avengers may not have worked as well as it should have. So in essence, I'm saying that aspect of the villains couldn't really be helped. However, there is something else that could have been helped, but was sort of subtly and pretty blatantly in some parts ignored. And that is the villain's motivation. What makes a good villain? A good villain is a person, a character, that believes in the same things as the heroes, but goes to another extreme to get them. We'll look at Killmonger and Thanos and Vulture a little bit later, but you can tell that these are people who want the same basic principles as the heroes. For example, justice, equality, freedom, etc. Now, in a lot of generic villains, you're going to see the same thing. You're going to see, I want something because I'm evil. That's it. And what do we see a lot in Phase 1? I want something because I'm evil. Obadiah Stane wants to be the Ironmonger because he turns insane. Great. Abomination wants to beat up the Hulk because, well, the Hulk embarrassed him, so that's really good, actually. That's a good motivation starting point, but that never gets explored. So when they're fighting at the end, he's fighting because he's evil. Whiplash has a good motivation to start with, like I mentioned in my review, but then it kind of just goes to, oh, look, a drone, and look, whips, and I'm evil. Great. Loki has a better motivation, and he's one of the better villains of Phase 1. He wants to do what he does because he wants to please his father, just like Thor. Now keep this in mind because, like I mentioned before, the villain and the hero want the same thing. In this case, they want their father's admiration, respect, and acceptance. Red Skull wants to rule the world because he's a Nazi, and he's evil. Great. And honestly, Loki in the Avengers wants to rule the Earth because he's evil. I mean, it's explored a little bit in Thor the Dark World that he really did it to please his father and all that and to rule and be a benevolent king like him, but honestly, he doesn't really have a lot of character development in the first Avengers. He has a lot more in the first Thor. So that's a little bit of an interesting note. We love Loki, and his performance by Tom Hiddleston in the Avengers is amazing, but the character development, not a huge part of that film. What I also like to say a lot in terms of the villain is that there is a difference between the performance and the character, and that's really important to distinguish. Because a good performance does not make a good character. You can have the most poorly written character played by the best actor, and it's not going to mask the character, although it's going to do a good job of that. And so what we have here in Phase 1 is a combination of either a bad character and a good performance, or a bad performance and a good character, or both. In these 6 films, you are rarely going to see both a good performance and a good character. So, in Iron Man, Obadiah Stane, good-ish performance, not so good character. Abomination, not great character, not great performance. Whiplash, not a great character, not a great performance. Loki, pretty good performance, but not a great character, although the motivations were there, he was okay. I'll give him a pass. Red Skull, great performance, pretty flimsy character. And Loki in the Avengers, I'm gonna say great performance, not a great character in that film. So what went wrong in Phase 1? Well, it wasn't really Marvel's fault, to be honest. I'm not going to fault them for this. I mean, yes, you could have rewritten the film so the villains were better. I acknowledge that. But in the grand scheme of things, if you have to make sacrifices here or there, make sacrifices that will benefit the heroes because that will work in your favor later. So, let's move on to Phase 2. Phase 2, I'm going to label swing and a miss. Because Marvel took some genuine risks with the villains, and I appreciate them for that. Unlike Phase 1, there were some genuine attempts to bring in some motivations and complex villains mixed in with some good performances for these villains. And there was a lot more screen time. So again, addressing that point I made for the Phase 1 movies, there is a lot more screen time in Phase 2 for the villains. For example, Aldrich Killian had some pretty decent character development. Alexander Pierce and the Winter Soldier, while not the most complex of characters because they're essentially just neo-Nazis, they were at least a little bit more complex in their ideologies. So that was interesting, at least. I think Ultron actually had some really decent motivations as well for being an artificial intelligence robot, and Yellow Jacket kind of had motivations. I mean, he didn't like Hank Pym because he booted him out, so... And then there's Ronan and Malekith, who are terrible. So the interesting thing about this, and if you notice the pattern here, is that the more grounded, Earth-based villains in Phase 2 get the better character motivation and development. And what I think Marvel is realizing here in real time, you can kind of follow their trajectory and their thinking, is that, okay, we have these Earthbound villains, these people, right? Or I guess a robot, but, based on artificial intelligence. These people, these real characters that the audience can relate to. We can now begin to give them real motivations and stakes. Aldrich Killian was spurned by Tony Stark, and that's why he became the way he was, because he was spited, just like Incrediboy or Syndrome in The Incredibles. Ultron saw the world as it was through a different lens, and that's why he wanted to cleanse the world of the Avengers and of people. Even Yellow Jacket had a sort of kind of motivation with Hank Pym. You can see that these Earth-bound, Earth-based villains have more deeper, complex histories and motivations. However, with the two cosmic villains, they didn't even try. And I think part of the thinking was, well, if they're just cosmic villains, we can just make them evil. The thinking probably was more in line of The Lord of the Rings. I use that example a lot, but Sauron is evil. Okay, fine. And so they thought, well, we're making sort of fantasy sci-fi films. The villains can just be evil, because no one really cares, right? And while Lord of the Rings may have captured lightning in a bottle, it doesn't always work that way to just have a big bad. And that's what they were trying to do with Ronan and Malekith. Didn't work. And listen, we can give Guardians of the Galaxy a pass because they're trying to introduce all these new characters and they didn't really want to focus on the villain, just like they were in Phase 1. But Thor the Dark World, I don't know what they were thinking because that was just bad. It's just bad. So here now, you can begin to see the dynamics shifting a little bit. You can see the balance sort of begin to shift towards better villains with better motivations. Because now the heroes are established, right? Captain America, Iron Man, Thor, I guess. They didn't even try. But the Avengers, they're established characters now. And as such, they had more room to play around with these characters. You know who they are now after seeing the Avengers. You know what they're about. And so the filmmakers were allowed to really, really get to play in that sandbox. And as such, the balance began to shift towards Phase 3. Phase 3, I'm going to call almost perfectly balanced. Right off the bat, here's something I want you to notice about Phase 3. Phase 3 only has 2 origin films, Doctor Strange and Captain Marvel. Before you get into the comments about Spider-Man Homecoming and Black Panther, they're origin films, kind of, but not really, because you've seen these characters before, right? So really the two true origin films that are introducing new characters for the very first time are Doctor Strange and Captain Marvel. And guess what? Both of their villains are awful. Caecilius and Yon-Rogg. Terrible villains. So what we're learning here is that the origin story films don't generally seem to work. And that's because you're setting up the foundations for the heroes and you don't have time, or I guess screen time, to set up the villains' arcs and motivations for themselves. But Phase 3 was really where the filmmakers got to play in this sandbox and really, really get to explore. And of course, the Russo brothers came in and really anchored everything down with Thanos. Now, the first thing that I want to note about Phase 3 villains is that they actually had, Marvel did, a better chance of getting a better villain in the audience's perception because they had the ability now to go out and get better actors. And I'm not saying that Phase 1 actors are bad, because Jeff Bridges is amazing, Hugo Weaving is amazing. But what you notice in Phase 1 is that the cast members, the cast that they picked, didn't necessarily fit the villain like a glove. In Phase 3, even though the villains may not have as much character motivation, you can see it that the villains, that the people that they cast to play these villains are really, really fitting into the role nicely. I'll give you two examples. Kurt Russell as Ego and Cate Blanchett as Hela. I don't think these two villains are particularly strong. And again, you'll notice these are two cosmic villains, just like in Phase 2. These are the Guardians and the Thor films, right? Like, they're, grander in scale and more sci-fi fantasy-esque, right? And so the villains aren't really given that big of a motivation. Fine, whatever. But what Marvel did better this time around was get actors to fit the roles much better. And they could do that because now they have the reputation coming off of Ant-Man leading into Civil War. They have the reputation now, and they're just continuing to build upon that. So actors like Kurt Russell and Cate Blanchett are more willing to join these big franchise films. The other thing that Marvel began to realize, and I think it was in large part because of the Russo brothers, because Joe and Anthony have talked extensively about how they believe a good villain is one that they believe is right, I think Marvel suddenly began to realize that the Russo's method was working. The Winter Soldier and Alexander Pierce were pretty decent, but then they brought in Baron Zemo. And I think Zemo is a really, really interesting character. Not because he has lasers or anything, but because he's a complex, nuanced, layered character who has deep-seated anger and motivations to tear the Avengers apart. And that's what they brought to Thanos. And so Marvel slowly began to realize that villains are villains not because they're evil, like I mentioned before, but because they think they're right. They want the same things as the hero. The Vulture wants to protect his family, and so does Peter Parker. Killmonger wants to bring justice and equality to the world, and so does T'Challa. Thanos wants to bring balance to the universe, and in large part so do the Avengers. This is the key to solving Marvel's villain problem, in realizing that villains are not villains because they have big guns or they wear red capes or because they have red eyes, but because they are people. The key to solving Marvel's villain problem, it doesn't matter who the villain is. It could be a purple titan with a, shiny gold glove with purple stones in them. I don't know. It could be an African-American man seeking justice for his marginalized people. It doesn't matter. You treat them the same in the sense that they are all normal people with real motivations. And that's how they fix their villain problem. So, what are the takeaways here? Well, first, I think it's good that Marvel seems to have figured this out. However, I don't think this is a guarantee that they're going to make perfect villains in Phase 4 or Phase 5. I don't think so. Because again, some of the appeal of comic book villains is, yeah, they're big and they have, lasers and they shoot blue beams into the sky. That's sort of the appeal, I guess. And I thought we might have been moving away from that, but if Marvel wants to continue down there, especially with films like The Eternals or Doctor Strange 2, they can, they might, they probably will. But at the same time, I think for films like Black Widow or Shang-Chi, or maybe even Thor Love and Thunder, they're going to start to realize that villains have nuance and they have layers. And I think that's a really good thing. Before we close, I want to point something else interesting, one last thing. I think a lot of the bad and poor villains in Marvel's history, the MCU, are not their fault. If you've made it all the way to the end of the video, well, first of all, kudos to you. Thank you for watching. But second of all, you'll notice something that I've been mentioning over and over again. And it's the fact that Marvel had to make necessary sacrifices. When you're building up heroes in origin story films, whether it be Iron Man, Doctor Strange, Ant-Man, you really can't put the main focus on the villain. However, once everything has been established and you're ready to go, you can then start to put a huge focus on villains like Thanos, who is essentially the protagonist of Avengers Infinity War. And on top of that, in Phase 1, Marvel didn't have the reputation that they had. As they began to grow both in terms of box office and critical reception, they were able to go and get better actors to fit their roles. They were able to get better talent to write for these actors. For example, in Phase 4, look at them. They have Christian Bale playing someone in Thor Love and Thunder. They have Sam Raimi to take over for Doctor Strange 2. Baron Zemo's coming back for the Falcon and the Winter Soldier. They have their ideas in place now, and they have the reputation to back it up. So what I'm saying is that while, yes, Phase 1's villains could have been better, Iron Man 2, I'm looking at you, and Phase 2 as well, Thor the Dark World, anyone? I'm also saying that in order to get the villains that we got, like Thanos and Vulture and Killmonger, we had to make those necessary sacrifices to build up the heroes first. So that was my take on how Marvel solved their villain problem. Do you agree or you do disagree? Let me know in the comments down below. If you liked that video, please make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. And if you want to check out some more videos, check out the videos on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.